little bit about me, and this is a little bit of a disclaimer. I recognize most of you, and yet if I see you in the grocery store or if I see you on the logging road and you say hi, I won't remember your name, okay? I'm horrible with names. With my family, I have my wife, Kamala. She has her sister, so it's Kamala, Carmen, Christine. And then we had our two daughters next in line. So it goes Kamala, Carmen, Christine. And then we had Kayla and Kara. And when we got our third daughter, I'm like, no more Ks. I can't do it. I am like so confused all the times with names. And it's just one of those things. Names are something some people are really good at. Other times, most of the time probably, for most people, if we're honest, you're like me and names get messed up. There was one time where I was given a name that was entirely incorrect, and it stuck with several people for a long time. My mom is a retired kindergarten teacher, and all the way back in the 80s, that's 1980s, I went to her class, and I was helping her, and she introduced me to all of her kindergartners. And there happened to be, in that kindergarten class, a little boy named Timmy, okay? So when she introduced me, she said to all of the kids in this kindergarten class, "This is my son. His name is Timmy too." Like, Timmy, T-O-O, right? For whatever reason, for the next, decade of my life, to a lot of people in this town, my name was Timmy too. And it took me forever to figure out what was going on with that. I would see little kids, and they'd be like, "Hi, Timmy too." And then, their parents would call me that. And I thought that was gone. I mean, that was back in the 80s. And literally just like a year ago, I'm on a walk, and I had somebody that was out doing yard work, and they turned around, and I said, "Oh, hi, good morning." And they looked at me, and this is someone who's like 70. And they turned around and they said, "Oh, hi, Timmy too." I'm like, good grief, right? None of you are allowed to call me that, by the way, all right? No. That's a name that stuck, and some people thought that was my name. And the reality was that was incorrect. Today, as we get into Genesis 22, I want to look at three different parts of it. And I want to look at the test, the name, and the lamb. The test, the name, and the lamb. And in this section, we are going to learn about one of the names of God. And a lot of you, when I get to the point and I say it, you will know that name, but it's actually incorrect the way you've been taught it. So bear with me as we jump into this. Genesis 22, starting at verse 1, we read this. "After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham?' And he said, 'Here I am.' And God said, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains on which I shall tell you.' So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, 'Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you.' And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, 'My father.' And Abraham said, 'Here I am, my son.' And he said, 'Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?' Abraham said, 'God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.' So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And so Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and the sand of the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now after these things, it was told to Abraham, Behold, Milcah has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz, his firstborn. Uz, this sounds better. Uz, his firstborn, Buz, his brother. I like that, Uz and Buz. Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Zidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel fathered Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Remuel, bore Teba, Gamma, Tahash, and Maacah. Wow. This is just an incredibly weird story. Okay? Let's focus in first and talk about the test. Right off the bat of this passage, what we find is that as Moses writes it to the children of Israel while they are traveling in the desert, he makes sure to say that this is happening because God is testing Abraham. What is he testing? He's testing his faith. Out of faith comes obedience. If you say you have faith in God, the natural outcome of that faith is obedience. All right? If you say you love God, the natural outcome of that love is also obedience. That's why Jesus told his disciples the night before he was crucified, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. And he says it twice in John. It's a natural outcome. Now, as we look at the passage, God doesn't go to Abraham first and tell him, hey, Abraham, I'm going to ask you to do something that I really don't want you to do. I'm asking you to do this because I'm just testing to see if you'll do it. All right? Abraham doesn't know this is a test. How many of you like tests? Right? All right, there is not an honest person in this place today because not one of you rose your hands. Either that or all of you are sick individuals who actually like tests, right? Nobody likes tests. It's just one of those things. We don't like being tested. I look at that and, whether it's I have to take a driving test because I'm getting older, that's not actually me, that's you that happened to. Nobody likes the driving test. Whether it's, you're in school and you have to get tested, nobody likes that. The worst test I ever took in my life was by a professor that told us you have to know everything in these 4 chapters, and I will test you on it, and every person in the class failed the test. Why? He only asked questions that had to do with the footnotes underneath pictures, right? Really? Really? Tests just don't seem fair a lot of times. This is a pop quiz that's happening. Abraham doesn't know what's taking place on this. He is just simply told by God, Abraham, take your son and you go sacrifice him to me. Now, in Abraham's mind, there's got to be a lot going on here. Because Abraham in his life, the typical thing we see is he does step out in faith and he obeys God. But note this, so far in the story of Abraham, usually he stalls, he waits, he questions. He is the great man of faith, the great man of obedience, but when he is told, like over 25 years before this, to go, leave your land and leave your family and go to the place I'll show you, he leaves his house and just moves to the city next door, basically. He leaves his home, but he doesn't leave his land or his family. Next, you see, several years later, the call comes again, and he does step out in faith and obey and go. He left his home that time, and he left his land, but he doesn't leave his family. He takes Lot with him. Then he goes to the land that God will show him, but it gets to a time of drought. He leaves. He gets into the stuff where there's the whole lie that happens where he tells Pharaoh down in Egypt that his wife is his sister, and all this bad stuff happens. You just see time and time and time again, Abraham either stalls and waits when God gives him a command, or he's also great at trying to barter with God and talk with God and sort of, negotiate stuff. And yet, on this one, we don't see that at all. Abraham gets up the very next morning and just goes. He takes his son, he takes 2 servants, he gets a donkey and puts all the wood and the rations they need on this donkey. And for 3 days, they travel to the region of Mount Moriah, where he will sacrifice his son. He doesn't wait. He instantly goes. He doesn't debate. He simply obeys. And the thing that's crazy with this is his son of promise. God had told him for 25 years, I am going to give you a son through your wife Sarah. And God waited to do that until Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90. God made sure that this son, Isaac, only was possible through the miracle of God, through the word of God, through the power of God. The Bible says that both Abraham and Sarah, in their bodies and their ability to reproduce, they were dead. And yet God brought life from death. That's the business he's in. And you look at it, now you have God saying to Abraham, hey, that son I promised, that son I told you would be a blessing to all nations, that son that, I said would just be a blessing to you and would carry on your name, yep, I want you to sacrifice that son to me. And he simply steps out to do it. I don't know about you, but if I heard one of you come to me and say, hey, God spoke to me and told me to go kill one of my children, the first thing I would do is tackle you. The next thing I would do is maybe beat you a little bit, and then I'd call the police. I'd be like, what? God didn't tell you that. That's crazy talk right there. That's evil. Like, what? God, that's out of the character of God. And Abraham knows that. He knows that God has given a judgment for people who take the blood of another human being. He knows that. So why in the world is he willing to step out and do this? Well, the Bible tells us this in Hebrews 11. We find out exactly what Abraham was thinking. And now think about this. He goes on the first day and he knows he's supposed to sacrifice his son. For 3 days, he has to travel to the place knowing that his son is as good as dead. But the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 11:17, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Abraham considered that God was able even to raise Isaac from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Isn't that incredible? Abraham is finally at a point in his life where he's not stalling when God tells him to do something. He's not arguing and debating when God tells him to do something. He is at a place where his faith is being tested like no other time in his life, and he simply just thinks, okay, well, God told me that I would be blessed through Isaac, that Isaac would, through him, there would come nations and kings. He would be a blessing to all the world, that I would have offspring like the stars in the sky, offspring like the sand on the beach. So, this all-powerful God is probably just going to raise him up from the dead. That's amazing. That was the kind of trust that Abraham had in God. That God's goodness was like nothing else. That God's power could create the miracle of life, and that God's promises were always true. And so Abraham, for 3 days, goes on a journey in order to obey God. Now, some people look at this passage and they just say, what kind of God is this? He's like a God that demands human sacrifice. No. This was a test. He would have stopped him one way or the other. He wasn't going to actually allow this to go on, but he simply wanted to see whether or not Abraham was going to put his money where his mouth was. I enjoyed reading just some things Warren Wiersbe had to say on this. In regards to this specific test and how God tests our faith at different times. This is what Warren Wiersbe said. He said, at the age of 75, Abraham enrolled in the school of faith. Now he was over 100, and he was still having soul-stretching experiences. We are never too old to face new challenges, to fight new battles, and to learn new truths. When we stop learning, we stop growing. And when we stop growing, we stop living. Wiersbe goes on and he says, our faith is not really tested until God asks us to bear what seems unbearable, to do what seems unreasonable, and expect what seems impossible. It's one thing for us to say, Lord, I put my faith in you. It's another thing to prove it by our obedience to him. Now, when we go through hard times, it's not always that God is testing our faith, but it could be. And this is a principle we see throughout the Bible, that God does test people. And sometimes the people in the Bible pass the test, and sometimes they fail miserably with the test. You can go through different people, and you say you look at Daniel in the lion's den. Was that a test? I'm sure it was. How did he score? A++++++. Right? That's incredible. You look at Elijah on Mount Carmel, and he is being confronted by hundreds of false prophets, and he challenges them to a test. This is a test of faith, though, for Elijah. And on that day, God answered his prayers in two different ways. At one time, he prayed, and God dropped fire from heaven and burned up the offering. And after years of drought, Elijah went to the edge of the cliff, and he prayed 7 times, and God brought rain. How did he do on that test that day? A++++++. And how did he do 40 days later? Not so great. As Jezebel threatened him, and for 40 days, he ran away. Peter, Lord, I'll follow you anywhere. How did he do on his test? When 3 times he was asked if he was a disciple of Jesus Christ. Right? I don't know why in my head I heard somebody say, survey says, right? You look at that, and Peter utterly failed. But know this, Peter denied Jesus Christ 3 times, but 3 different times, Jesus also looked at Peter afterwards and said, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Even when we are tested and we fail, God's grace abounds. God's grace abounds. Now, within this testing, Abraham learns a new name for God, or he gives God a new name. We see this, and just let me run with me here. In verse 8, we have the words, Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. God will provide a lamb. And in verse 14, we read, so Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord, all capital L-O-R-D, will provide. The Lord will provide, and as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord, Yahweh, it will be provided. Does anyone know what name we just read there? Jehovah Jireh. All right? Anyone ever heard that name of God before? Yeah? Kind of want to dance right now. Jehovah Jireh, my provider. Anyone know that song? Okay. You guys are leaving me hanging today. Good grief. Don't leave me hanging. Be kind. Rewind. You look at it, and it's something that I've grew up learning from songs and from other things. Jehovah Jireh, my provider. That's the words, the Lord will provide. That's not what that actually says. That's not what that says in Hebrew. And for the life of me, I spent hours and hours and hours this week trying to figure this out. Like, the actual Hebrew doesn't say the Lord will provide. It does not say that. If you go to the Greek Septuagint, before Jesus Christ was born, the Jewish people translated the Old Testament Hebrew into Greek because Koine Greek was the common language. And how did they translate it there so that we can understand how they understood that word? Did they translate it in a way into Greek, Koine Greek, as the Lord will provide? No, that's not what it says there. Does the King James say the Lord will provide? No, King James doesn't say that. And I'm not even a King James fan. For some reason, in the last 40 to 50 years, all of our modern translations keep translating that the Lord will provide, and that word is not there. When it says, on the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. That word is not there. It literally says, Yahweh will see. Yahweh does see. on the mount of Yahweh, the Lord, he will see. I spent hours this week. I was consulting with people who speak Hebrew. Like, what is this? Well, I don't know. It was driving me crazy this week. It's not the word provide. All I can come up with is that I think translators that were theologians have been translating in such a way to try to get the concept of provision. Because Abraham told Isaac that God would provide a lamb. And so what happens is when it says here, the Lord sees, what they try to do with it is say, and you'll see this in a few translations like the Message, the Lord will see to it. That's not what that says either. They're trying to get to the idea that God provides. Does God provide? Yes, absolutely he does. But my concepts of this are blown because I look at it, does this, in this context and in this passage about provision from the Lord, does that mean he's going to provide for my IRS bill? No, that's not what it's talking about. Doesn't mean that by the year 2035, Oregon's going to mandate that we all have EVs, that he's going to provide an EV for you. In this church, I'm surprised no one's throwing something at me right now. No, that doesn't mean that. That doesn't mean that. It's providing a lamb, providing a sacrifice. But what's happening in the context, this is a test, and God sees Abraham. He sees him. He sees his actions. He sees his faith. He sees his obedience. He sees his heart. In fact, there's another famous story where this same word and phrase is used. It's when Samuel, in 1 Samuel, is told, hey, Saul's no longer the anointed king. Go to the house of Jesse. I am going to show you who the new king is, and you're supposed to anoint him. And Samuel goes into the house of Jesse, and he sees Jesse's oldest son, this big guy, good looking and ripped, right? Just like your pastor. And he's like, oh, surely this is the new king. This right here is the new king. And God tells Samuel, no. You see, you're judging like a man right now. You're looking at the outside. But that's not how I judge. I see a man's heart. That's what's happening in this story. God is providing because he sees exactly what is going on with Abraham. And that is so much more encouraging to me. God provides because he sees. Have you ever felt like you were overlooked by somebody? I know you have. But God sees you. He sees your heart. He sees your small steps of faith that nobody's ever noticed. He sees your obedience that nobody else realizes is there. We serve a God who sees. I said we want to focus on the test, the name, and the name is Yahweh sees, and the Lamb. Oh my goodness. This is a crazy prophetic text. And I'm sure a lot of you were catching this, but there is so much here. This entire text is pointing forward into the future to look at Jesus Christ from beginning to end. Look at the stuff that is said here. Abraham. And Abraham said, here I am. And God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on the mountains of which I shall tell you. Whoa. Okay, let's just break some of these things down here a little bit. He is told, take your son, your only son. Think for a second. At this time, does Abraham have only one son? No. He has a son that's older than Isaac, Ishmael. Whoa, what's happening here? Galatians talks about that, and Paul actually addresses this whole story over and over in Galatians to talk about the gospel of Jesus Christ and to bring home that we are saved by the promise of God's grace. You look at this, he is the only son that is the promise of God's grace, God's provision. And that's why 3 or 4 different times in this passage, you get this kind of conversation about there being an only son. Notice, too, in verse 2, whom you love. There is within biblical theology a certain principle that we use where when the first time a word is used in the Bible, that sets how we define it for the rest of the Bible. Why is that important? This is the first time the word love is used in the Bible. And so, how is love defined? The father's love for a son. You could say a parent's love for a child. That is how love is defined. And what does this mirror? Say it with me, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. Did I quote it like it was up there? I have it memorized in King James, in NIV, and ESV, and now they're all just blending together. I one time had it memorized in Hawaiian Pidgin, but I won't do that one for you. That's actually a really good way to read it. You look at this, and this is amazing. This is a story, and it's looking forward to Jesus Christ. You have in here, Abraham told to go to the region of Moriah. Where is Moriah? Where is Mount Moriah? Mount Moriah isn't just a mount like we think. When you go to Bend, there's on the east side of Bend, Pilot Butte. How many of you ever hiked Pilot Butte? How many of you didn't want to go to Pilot Butte, so instead you went to Pilot Butte Burger? Yeah. You look at Pilot Butte, you look at it, it's just one big cinder cone, and it's tall and it's big. And you'll see things like that in Israel. But if you look on the west side of Bend, you have Aubrey Butte. Aubrey Butte doesn't look anything like Pilot Butte because it's not this nice cinder cone. It's this big, long ridge line that keeps moving in elevation. That is what Mount Moriah is. And on one end of Mount Moriah at this time, you had a city called Salem with a king named Melchizedek. And that city became Jerusalem. Further down, you have the place that was a field that Solomon bought on Mount Moriah, and he built a temple. And then you go up to the highest point, and you have a place called Golgotha. By the time of Jesus Christ, it's the place where he was crucified. You literally have Isaac, who was as good as dead for 3 days, carrying the wood that would be the implement for the sacrifice, just as Jesus Christ carried his own cross. Up to the top of this Moriah, and Abraham says, God sees this. He will provide a lamb. Can I ask you this? Within the story, did God provide a lamb? Yes or no? No, he did not provide a lamb. He provided a ram, which in my mind is driving me crazy all week long as I've been reading this, because you have a ram and a lamb, and I grew up with my parents listening to 50s music, and Ram-a-Lam-a-Ding-Dong has been in my head. I look at this, and it's like, God didn't provide a ram because, a lamb. He provided a ram. I'm going to get myself confused. Why? Because the lamb that he would provide was coming from the line of Isaac in the future. Revelation 5, verse 5. And one of the elders said to me, "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." This is a prophetic vision that John has. And the 7 seals, it's a scroll that is sealed up, and it is the deed to the entire earth, to all of creation. Whoever can open it is the king and the ruler of all creation, and no one could be found to open that. And now John hears the Lion of the tribe of Judah is here. The Lion of Judah. He comes from the line of kings, but what he sees is not a lion. Verse 6, and between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders, I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain, with 7 horns and with 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. And when he took the scroll from the right hand of him who was seated on the throne, and when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seal. For you were slain, and by your blood ransomed people before God, from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." Amen. I'm going to invite our worship team up, and we're going to end this service by taking communion. We're going to worship. And if you're visiting today, the way we do this at our church is we're going to just sing one last song, and you have freedom of movement, all right? If you want to stay right where you are and just sing, that's awesome. Sing your heart out to the Lord. Sing it like you mean it. If you want to pray, you don't have to sing, you can pray. But there's elements of communion up front on these tables and in back, and feel free during this time to get out of your seats and go take communion on your own or with your family. But as you do that, Jesus said to take communion and do it in remembrance of him. I want to leave us with these words from just an amazing preacher and pastor, Tim Keller. And this is what he says about this. Jesus is the true and better Isaac, who was not just offered up by his Father on the mount, but was truly sacrificed for us. And when God said to Abraham, "Now I know you love me because you did not withhold your son, your only son whom you love from me," now we can look at God, taking his son up the mountain and sacrificing him, and say, "Now we know that you love us because you did not withhold your son, your only son, whom you love from us."